members can contribute to the effectiveness and authority of the Security Council?
In terms of British government, our policy is very clear that we would like to see an enlargement of both permanent and non-permanent members. We are currently supporting the proposal that there should be 4 new permanent members: Japan, Germany, India and Brazil, and new elected members. When I say we're supporting the proposal, we're supporting that outcome. We're not yet wedded to a precise proposal that's on the table because we're still looking at the text put forward by the so-called G4 countries. But anybody who tells you they know the outcome of this subject, I think deludes themselves, because I certainly don't. There are at least now 3 proposals around. There's the so-called G4 one I've described. There's one from the Uniting for Consensus group, previously known as the Coffee Club, whose preference is to see just elected members added, and that they'd be happy to see either all elected for 2 years, or 10 divided 5 for 2 years, and 5s of semi-permanent for a 5-year period, or even longer. And this morning, you may have read in the newspaper, there's an interesting third idea emerging from the United States, which is that there should be 2 permanent members, and that there should be perhaps 3 semi-permanent members, which will take the council perhaps up to 20. Whatever happens requires, if it's going to pass, 2/3 of the membership. 128 countries will have to agree, and Charter Amendment will require that. And then subsequently, national ratification by parliaments will have to cover 2/3 of the membership. And crucially, the 5 permanent members must each nationally ratify any increase. Chance of doing that in the next month or so, which was the plan. I don't know, I don't think I've got lots of money on it tonight in terms of doing it in the next month. The position has become really quite murky. And it's murky because most people would rally to the idea that councils should be more legitimate and larger in order to reflect a larger membership of the GA, that the working methods of the council should become more transparent, more open, even perhaps more accountable, some would say. When you go beyond that to say now, which are the countries which should come onto the council permanently, there seem to be a lot of other countries who have particular reasons why some of them shouldn't come on. And the negative is going to weigh heavily in the debate, as is the fact that quite a large number of countries don't appear to have made up their mind. And of those who profess to have made up their mind, you always have to discount the sort of 30% factor of those who tell you one thing, but it doesn't seem necessarily to come out like that when the votes are cast. So, I don't really know, but I think the next month are going to be quite interesting on the subject.
On the question of democracies forming their own group or their own coalition, is this a reality or sort of a fallback position if nothing comes out or not enough comes out of the summit? Is this just people sort of whistling in the air?
I think it's whistling in the air. And I give you 3 simple reasons why it sort of promulgated a little bit after the Iraq fracas. If that Iraq was a group of democracies, it wouldn't be quite like that, ignoring the fact that most of the countries who were causing the difficulty were undoubtedly democratic. The democratic institutions or groups like the European Union didn't have a position on Iraq because the issue was too difficult. Secondly, how would you define actually a democracy? What's the test? Is it 100% democratic? Is it just 90%? And in the end, you find that really so difficult. The democratic model that we all have really is quite different. The British model isn't the same as others. We think we are the mother of democracy, which upsets the Icelanders, as Churchill found out when he went and said that, and had to say, but I address myself to the grandmother of democracy. But the other fact is, to make the division, by definition, is divisive. And if you believe in universality, and trying to bring everybody along. Better to have membership of 191 countries. I think that's the best route. But to go down something which is much more aggressive in terms of promoting peace, democracy, rule of law, stopping conflict. If I asked how many people the UN has in the Secretariat who work specifically on rule of law, on democracy, on conflict prevention, it's probably not more than a couple of handfuls. We've got to do much more of that. Rule of law and promoting democratic principles. And all that that entails is actually a massive endeavor. The UN does a huge job on elections, but democracy is much more than elections. It's actually getting institutions, it's getting law of all sorts. It's actually making sure that people understand what it is they're voting for, that there are parties, that democracy is founded on something. And we don't do enough.
I understand that the new Human Rights Council will be smaller and that they will raise the bar for membership in that council. And I wonder what would the criteria for that membership be and who would make that judgment. And presumably, if the criteria includes protection of prisoners within one's country, is it conceivable that the dispute and the debate over Americans holding prisoners in Guantanamo could muster a sufficient 30% to prohibit the United States from being on the new Human Rights Council?
Well, I think in terms of the way I answered the previous question, and the idea of being divisive or not in terms of democracy, I apply the same test really to Human Rights Council. Criteria are perforce difficult. I think you answered your own question in the way you put it, so I won't go down that route. But I will say that the preferred way to ensure that there's some legitimacy of whoever would sit on the council is to increase the threshold, the number of votes they obtain. Now, if you, for example, say that 2/3 of the GA membership needs to vote for somebody who's going to sit on the council, that's a pretty high test. But it's not a guarantee. My guess is that some of the countries that say the United States would least like to see well still get 128. But the chances of that must diminish. I think that the way you get at it is a higher voting threshold. I made one qualification to the man asking the next question, but he's better qualified than I to answer it himself.
I doubt that, because I wanted to ask you more about what you meant by a particular thing that you said, which was that the Secretary General should be more accountable and more transparently accountable to the member states. I think you gave an example about appointments. Are you suggesting that all senior appointments within the Secretariat should be made according to the procedure that has now been adopted for the funds and programs? In other words, that there should be a public short list. Do you have other ideas about what are the particular things that you feel are not transparent to you as a member state about the way the Secretariat works, and then how can we improve it?
Let me repeat my basic principle. It is the Secretary General is fettered too much and needs to be able to run his own organisation. Test of that is, I'll say this publicly. In a lunch, somebody said to the Secretary General, "What are we doing about conflict prevention?" And he said, "That's one of our priorities in my second term." He turned to one of his colleagues and said, "How many people do we now have working on this?" Answer, no more than we had before, because we have not had approval in the budgetary process to be able to actually find people. I don't have flexibility to move forward. Now in my mission, if something is really a priority, then I move from there to there to respond to whatever the problem is. Member states do not allow the Secretary General of the United Nations to have freedom. But there's also a problem, which is, if you now go along to the US Congress and say, we really want far more flexibility for the Secretary General, they might look at some of their criticisms in relation to, say, oil for food, and say this isn't really tactically the best moment to ask for that. I can understand that. But what we have to do is strike the sensible bargain. If you were CEO of a company, you'd be answerable to the shareholders. You would have to explain how you exercise your responsibilities, but you will be accountable. The Secretary General of the United Nations is not accountable. Now, I don't want to be too critical directly, so I'll answer the question in a slightly different way. I tried to make very sure when I was on the board of the Foreign Office in London that all jobs went according to 3 simple principles. That every job was advertised, so anybody who wished to apply could apply. That was my second principle. And the third one is very simple, that the best qualified got the job on merit. That doesn't apply in the United Nations. It's a great nebulous fog. And none of us quite know what jobs are up. We don't know how they actually merge. And the white smoke that came out of the Vatican is fairly transparent in comparison. What was done for the UNDP job is certainly an improvement. And it was advertised, criteria was set out. But you know, on accountability, let me say this, there are special representatives around the world doing essential jobs. I don't know what their terms of reference are, but the harder indictment is that they don't have actual terms of reference. They don't actually have a set of objectives given to them. For the most part, they go out and make it up as they go along. They're guided by a little bit of advice from headquarters, and they've often got a Security Council resolution which covers it. But I operate on the basis of London, and I agree at the beginning of a financial year, these are your objectives. And I have to set out for each of my objectives what it is I intend to achieve. And the last column measures the outputs I got. And if I don't achieve the outputs, I'm in difficulty with London. That's the sort of accountability that the Secretariat needs, and we ought to give you the freedom to be in a position to do that. But it needs a degree of organisation, and it's a long way away from where we are now. The accountability is, well, are these things being put in place? Do we have recruitment procedures which meet these tests? But the other side of the same coin is it reasonable to assume that most people in the Secretariat only have contracts for 2 years? Where is the career progression for people who work in the United Nations? What do they expect? And they shouldn't have to put up with the present conditions either. So the need for substantial change and improvement is there. And the problem is, we're an organisation which is not good at reacting to change. That, hence my quip about, inertia has its own momentum, but it is true. And we have to shake ourselves out of that. Because organisations that don't change, fossilise, and in the end they die. And that's why people have to adapt to the problem. So what I've tried to sketch out earlier is change, but which means the organisation is better placed, and it's targeted at how we should be addressing in the next years.
Thank you, Sir Emir. 2 quick questions. The first is concerning civil society participation in this process leading up to reform. Much of what you've discussed has taken place behind closed doors by governments and more recently by politicians in capitals. There is very little traction for it among the publics of countries or civil society at large. Could you comment on the implications of this for any of the reform that's taking place or will take place? The second is more your speculation on the possibility of the United Nations rapid force to deal with issues of responsibility to protect, because the absence of a ready standby force has really prevented our capacity to deal with crises. I know it's not part of the package, but do you see in the immediate or long-term future actually such a possibility?
You say in general, civil society for us plays a very important part. certainly for the UK mission, we spend a lot of time working with civil society, and especially in terms of Security Council business, it's a very valuable contribution that we receive. I don't think it's quite fair to say everything's been behind closed doors. The effort to try and explain what is being done, the public debates in the General Assembly were open to everyone. There is specifically a session for, I think, 2 days with civil society at the end of this month. Perhaps the organisation of that hasn't been quite as open and with as much notice as might have been the case. But certainly I plan to have extensive meetings with the British people coming to brief them, and we will take part fully in that session with civil society. So I think it will happen. Frankly, I'd like to see more of it. The short answer to you on standby force is no, I don't think it's a good idea. And that may seem a contradiction. But the reason is that it seems to me for both police and military to try and set a standby international force causes so many problems in terms of funding, training, where they stand by, that actually the answer, and there is a very real need for an answer, but the answer is a different approach, which is to say what you need are forces and police which at very short notice can be made available to the United Nations. That's the system that the European Union has moved to. I've in the past had something to do with that and was very opposed to the idea that there should be a European force. What the EU did commit itself to was to produce 50,000 men at 60 days notice capable of being deployed for at least 12 months. And we've built on that and said now we undertake to produce a battle group which will be available at 15 days notice. That seems to be a better route because while those forces are not needed, they're used nationally or within whatever the international configurations they take part in exercises or whatever. But provided the notice is respected, they can be made available. And that was why the French and the British proposed the battle group for the European Union on the basis that if necessary, it could be made available to NATO or to the United Nations. So we're better getting the readiness of our national forces so that they can be made available.